guess we're going to get started here. There'll probably be people walking in and out, and that's totally great and fine. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mark Woodall. I'm a third-year ND student, and we've got Gary Taubes speaking tonight. He's the New York Times bestselling author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, and Why We Get Fat. That came out 2 or 3 years ago. I asked Gary to come talk here through an email after being in a conversation and sitting in class and things like that, and I really felt like the knowledge on fat and metabolism and obesity was needed a little fewer refining points, and so I emailed him, and he decided he would be able to come talk. So if you guys could give a warm welcome to Gary Taubes. So you guys know there'll be a 30-minute Q&A at the end of his presentation. So if you have questions, just hold them to the end, and we can get that going.
Okay, hi. So the sound is good. You guys can all hear me. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm a journalist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a dietitian. Just a little bit of background. I got into this because since the mid-1980s, I've been fascinated by the subject of bad science, which is the science of things that aren't so. It's surprisingly easy to do bad science, which is something I learned when I was writing my first book, and I've been obsessed with it ever since. And I started off in high-energy physics and nuclear physics, and in the early 90s, some of my friends in the physics community said, if you're interested in bad science, you should look at some of the stuff in public health because it's terrible. So I moved into writing about public health issues in the early 90s, and by the late 90s, I had stumbled accidentally into the nutrition field, literally purely by chance. I spent about a year working on a story for the journal Science on salt and blood pressure. And one of the worst scientists I'd ever had the pleasure to interview took credit not just for getting Americans to eat less salt, but to get them to eat less fat and less eggs as well. So I literally got off the phone, I called my editor at Science, and I said, when I'm done writing about salt, I'm going to write about fat and eggs, because one of the messages of all my research had been that bad scientists never get the right answer. And I said, if this guy was involved in any substantive way, obviously there's a story here. I don't know what it was. I had no preconceptions. I spent a year working on this story for Science. I interviewed about 140 people for one magazine article, and I've basically been stuck in that field ever since. And as Mark knows, I've recently started a not-for-profit. I will never get out of the nutrition field. So I could give a lot of lectures on fat and saturated fat, on salt and blood pressure, on bad science and nutrition. I like to give the Why We Get Fat lecture because this is one of the pillars of our understanding of what constitutes a healthy diet, is our understanding of what causes obesity. And one of the things I learned in the course of my research is that our understanding is, from my take, completely wrong. And I'm going to try and convince you that this is true, or at least worth considering seriously, okay? So, I got a lot of buttons here. Okay, the context, obviously, we have an obesity epidemic, and as doctors and nutritionists and health practitioners, you are going to see an awful lot of obese patients. You're going to see an awful lot of diabetes patients. Diabetes in this country has increased fivefold since the early 1970s. And one of the things I find fascinating, actually, even with the obesity numbers, the year I was born, 1956, there were less than 200 articles published in the indexed medical literature on obesity. Okay, last year there were over 16,000 papers published, and that goes along with this massive increase in obesity rates. So you can think there's been an epidemic of obesity and an epidemic of obesity research that has had no effect on the epidemic of obesity. I mean, there's about 24 people with leptin deficiency disorders who have been helped by our research. And for the rest of it, it's just no effect. So one of the ways you could think of what I had the opportunity to do is imagine you were the head of the Obesity Society or the NIH Institute that funded obesity research, or even the American Heart Association, because obesity and diabetes are associated with heart disease and cancer and stroke and other diseases. And you might have said, look, we've got this huge increase in obesity rates during a period of time when we believe that we completely understand the cause of obesity. So maybe we got something wrong. Like if this was the number of HIV patients or AIDS patients, you might think, well, when we thought we figured out what caused AIDS in the mid-1980s, that it was the HIV virus, and we created all these antiretroviral drugs, and if they weren't doing anything, by 2013, you'd say, maybe we got something wrong. Maybe it's not HIV that causes AIDS. So what I'm saying is maybe our understanding of obesity is wrong, and I had the opportunity, I had the funding to go back and look. And you'd think that people would be glad that somebody had been doing this, because an obvious implication of this kind of curve is that we're missing something. So what I did, I got in 2002, I actually did get a large book advance based on a very controversial New York Times Magazine article I wrote that allowed me to spend 5 years of my life researching and writing about obesity at a time in which the internet made it possible to find all primary sources. Okay, so at one point I had graduate students and undergrads at 5 different universities around the country going to their local med school libraries, doing nothing but Xeroxing articles or books and mailing them to me, because I could locate all the sources. So in the course of 5 years, I got to do as much research as would have taken 30 or 40 years just a decade earlier. A kind of mathematical phenomenon I can't quite figure out. But the result was good calories, bad calories. Okay, despite the faux diet book title, it's a dense, thick, 160 pages of endnotes and bibliography. It's basically a revisionist history and science of obesity and chronic disease. Nobody could read it, unfortunately, because it's so dense. So by 2011, I had a lot of people, 2010, I had a lot of people saying, look, this book changed my life, could you please write one that, my father could read or my brother could read. I had doctors writing me saying, could you write one that I could give to my patients and they could maybe get through? And patients saying, could you write one that I could give to my doctors and they could maybe get through? So I wrote Why We Get Fat, which is like the airplane reading version of it. It can be read between here and Cleveland, and you could still have an hour to think about it before you land in New York. Okay, so that's the background. As we said, with obesity comes this cluster of chronic diseases. Stroke, heart disease, gallbladder disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, neurodegeneration, which includes Alzheimer's, and then cancer. And the conventional wisdom today is as you get fat, something about the state of being fat, maybe the inflammatory molecules that are released by macrophages trapped in your fat tissue increases your risk of these diseases. And what I want you to keep in mind is that there's a simpler hypothesis, which is whatever makes you fat causes these diseases. Okay, so the same thing that makes you fat, and some people believe this today anyway by considering like diabetes a disease almost of sedentary behavior. And the idea is that sedentary behavior makes us fat, and being fat is associated with type 2 diabetes, so sedentary behavior is also a cause of type 2 diabetes. I'm going to argue, again, that subtext is whatever makes us fat makes us sick as well. So this lecture could have been called Why Do We Get Sick instead of Why Do We Get Fat? And at the end, when you're thinking what he's proposing is surely unhealthy, what I'm proposing is actually something that should make us healthier and not just thinner. Okay, so here's the conventional wisdom on why we get fat. Fundamental cause of obesity and overweight is an energy imbalance between calories consumed and expended. If in the technical literature, you'll see this phrase, obesity is an energy balance disorder. Calories in greater than calories out, right? And the result, we overeat. And then you have to answer this question, that's what makes an individual fat, right? So what causes the obesity epidemic? Because one of the things you do in science is you have an observation, we've all been getting fat, that the population has been getting fatter over the last 30 years. What's the cause of that? And here's the slide. This is it, okay? Increased prosperity. This is a phrase Marion Nestle, an NYU nutritionist, used back in 2002 or so in Science. The idea is as populations get more affluent, is more energy-dense food available. It's everywhere at fast food joints and vending machines. You can't walk 20 feet without getting food, and simultaneously there's all this reason to be sedentary now. We don't have to work for our food. One obesity researcher told me you don't have to kill a woolly mammoth for dinner, but literally, computers, video games, iPads keep our children home and inactive. We don't even walk to school. They don't walk to school. They don't bike around because we don't let them. And all this sedentariness combined with all this energy-dense food, and the end result is this sort of toxic, obese environment. And you could describe it, here's the hypothesis. So too much food, too little physical activity leads to overeating, energy in greater than energy out, right? And the end result is the obesity and the obesity epidemic. Okay, so this makes perfect sense. What I want to ask, just to get a feel, is how many of you believe this? Be honest. I actually gave this talk at the Tufts University Nutrition Department, which is like as much as any single nutrition department in the country created this concept. And I said, how many of you believe this? I'm like, not a single one of them raised their hand. And I said, okay, then I can go. Because what I'm going to do is convince you this is nonsense, I hope. And then they all put their hand up. So do you really believe it, or do you, have you been, okay, 7 people believe it. That's good. 9, 10, 11. It's okay. I believe this. I did. It is a hypothesis, however. Okay, it seems like it was written in stone and passed down on tablets from whichever mount. I always forget which mount it is. Sinai. Yeah. But it's a hypothesis. So what we can do is we can ask the question, is it true, like any science? So one of the things you do when a scientist to test hypotheses is you look for counterexamples. If your hypothesis is all swans are white, you look for black swans, right? Because white swans won't actually. Is that water? Yep. Is that obvious? So in the course of my research, remember I had this opportunity to look through the medical literature. So you can look for populations that had high levels of obesity and had none of this toxic, obesogenic environment that we blame obesity on today. Okay, so here's a list of, I found about a dozen of them in the literature. Beginning in 1928 with a study done by 2 University of Chicago economists at the South Dakota Crow Creek Reservation of the Native American tribe, the Sioux. So these people in 1928, they said these people were so poor as it defied imagination in 1928. So you can imagine how poor they were today. So they had 4 to 8 people in one-room shacks, no plumbing, no running water. Their food was mostly government rations. Poverty was unbelievable. Malnutrition was rife on this reservation. And yet 40% of the women, 10% of the men, and a quarter of the children were distinctly fat or obese. And this went along with a significant portion of the population being extremely thin and then malnourished, and there was obvious signs of deficiency diseases throughout the reservation. And this is a combination, this obesity and malnutrition in the same population, even in the same families, is now known as the double or dual burden of obesity and malnutrition. And you could read about it in the literature as though it's a new observation, but you could see it was obvious even to these economists in 1928. We could go to this study in Trinidad, 1961-63. Trinidad was suffering a malnutrition crisis. Deficiency diseases were killing people. Children were dying of undernutrition. And the U.S. government sends a team of nutritionists down to help out. And they come back reporting that 1/3 of the women over 25 are obese, and obesity is a potentially serious medical problem in the women. In the following year, an MIT nutritionist went down to quantify the diet being consumed and reported that the diet were fewer than 2,000 calories, which was less at the time than was the Food and Agricultural Organization thought was necessary for a healthy diet. The top study there, Bantu pensioners in South Africa. This is the poorest of a black population in South Africa pre-apartheid. And this is a poor, disenfranchised population, yet 30% of the women were severely overweight. And then in 1974, going down, Chilean factory workers. These are people working on construction lines in Chile. Most are engaged in heavy labor, so they're not exercising regularly. They don't belong to health clubs. They're not training for triathlons. But we could be pretty confident that these are very physically active individuals who are probably expending a lot more energy in their lives than we are in ours. I did physical manual labor for 3 weeks one summer in college, and I never want to do it again. And yet, 30% of the women were obese and 10% were undernourished. 50% of the women over 54 were obese. So here's that combination of obesity and undernourishment. And by undernourishment, they mean they're emaciated. You can see signs that they're not getting enough calories. And then this last study in 1981, Mexican-Americans in Starr County, Texas. Starr County, about 200 miles due south of San Antonio. It's right on the Mexico border. This was a study done by a University of Texas cardiologist. Again, most inhabitants are employed in agricultural labor and or work in the oil fields in the country, so they are hard-working, physically active population, yet roughly half of the older men and women were obese. There was one restaurant in Starr County, Texas in 1981. It was a Mexican restaurant. There was no McDonald's, no Burger Kings, no Taco Bells, none of the toxic environment that we want to blame obesity on today. You know, these kids were not sitting at home watching television and playing computers and video games. And their mothers were not sitting at home knitting, they were out working. So why were these people fat? That's the question. And there's a principle in science, you know, Occam's razor, never complicate a hypothesis when a simple hypothesis will do. If we can figure out why these populations were fat, we could probably figure out why we're fat. It's probably the same thing. It might not be, but this is the way we would want to start it. So here's how that question was asked in 1973 by a British diabetes specialist named Ralph Richards, who in the early 1960s went to Jamaica and opened a diabetes clinic at the University of the West Indies. So in 73, he comes to London, he's speaking at a conference, he says 2/3 of the adult women in Jamaica are obese, 2/3. And he says it's difficult to explain the high frequency of obesity seen in a relatively impecunious society. It's a poor society, such as exists in the West Indies when compared to the standard of living enjoyed in the more developed countries. So he's asking the same question, man, why is it this poor country the people are so fat? We expect rich countries to be fat, because they're the ones that can eat as much as they want, don't have to be physically active. Malnutrition and subnutrition are common disorders in the first 2 years of life. Subnutrition continues in early childhood to the early teens, and then obesity begins to manifest itself from the 25th year of life and reaches enormous proportions from 30 onwards. Now, here's that same question discussed 30 years later after this idea that obesity was an energy balance disorder set in like ice on a pond, okay? In the 1970s, most people still wrote about obesity as being a disorder of malnutrition. It's the idea something's wrong with the food supply, we don't know what it is. By 2005, it had become an energy balance disorder, a sort of overnutrition. This is Benjamin Caballero, who runs the laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, Laboratory of Human Nutrition at Hopkins, writes an article in the New England Journal of Medicine on this dual burden of obesity and malnutrition. And he says, a few years ago, I was visiting a primary care clinic in the slums of Sao Paulo, and the waiting room was full of mothers with thin, stunted young children exhibiting the typical signs of chronic undernutrition. Their appearance sadly would surprise few who visit poor urban areas in the developing world, but what might come as a surprise that many of the mothers holding those infants were themselves overweight. And then he says, the coexistence of underweight and overweight poses a challenge to public health programs, since the aims of programs to reduce undernutrition, which would make more food available, are obviously in conflict with those for obesity prevention, which is make less food available, right? So I poses a challenge to public health programs in bold italics, because this coexistence of underweight and overweight doesn't pose a challenge to your public health programs, it poses a challenge to your paradigm, your belief system. If you believe that those mothers got obese merely by taking in superfluous calories that they didn't need to fuel their bodies, then you have to ask yourself, why didn't they give those calories to their kids who are starved, stunted, and undernourished? Okay, you've got two competing paradigms here. You have a paradigm of maternal behavior that says mothers will starve so their children can live. And you have a paradigm of obesity that says the mothers got fat because they were sneaking outside and eating Snickers bars, right, when nobody was looking. And you just ask the question, why weren't the mothers giving the Snickers bars to the kids? That's a sort of shallow way to put it. How many of you in here are mothers? I know most of you are students, but there's a few mothers. The question is, would you let your child starve so you could overeat? Right? So that highly suggests that there's something else going on here. You've got to be able to explain this observation. And it's funny, because in physics, the field I grew up on, the scientists talk about anomalous observations. Anomalous observation is an observation that your theory can't explain. And you look for anomalous observations because you want observations that your theory can't explain so you can hone your theories or improve them or throw them out if necessary. And we've been sitting on this one for 70-odd years, and nobody cares. We perceive it as a challenge to public health programs when it is a fundamental problem with the hypothesis. Okay, so here's some more reasons to question the energy balance way of thinking about obesity. If eating too much makes you fat, eating less should make you thin, right? Simple enough. But if you actually do clinical trials to test this hypothesis, what you find is that weight loss is so small as to be clinically insignificant. Cochrane collaboration, by the way, is a collaboration that was founded to do unbiased reviews of medical interventions, the assumption being that most reviews of medical interventions are biased by the preconceptions of the researchers, so I like to use the Cochrane collaboration if they have a finding available. So you can then ask yourself, should this be surprising that eating less doesn't work? And this is how Hilda Brooke put it. Hilda Brooke was a leading authority on pediatric obesity in the mid-20th century in the United States, okay? She was an interesting figure. She was a German researcher who came over to the US like many Germans did in 1933, because that's when the Nazi Party took power in Germany. And she got here, and she went to Boston first, and she went to New York. And she was walking around New York in 1934 in the heart of the Depression, when 40% of the workforce was out of work. This is the era of bread lines and soup kitchens. And she couldn't believe how fat the kids were on the streets of New York in the worst year of the Depression. She described them as roly-poly fat kids. And she started a pediatric obesity clinic at Columbia University to study the problem. And she said in the book she wrote in 1957, said, look, more than any other illness, the physician treating the obese patient is called upon only to do a special trick, to make the patient do something, stop eating, after it's already been proved that he cannot do it. Everyone who's overweight and obese knows they're supposed to eat less, okay? You don't need a PhD for that. And everyone tries to eat less, and if they're still overweight and obese, that tells you that it's not working for them. And the existence of the obesity epidemic tells you it's not working for America. So there's a reason why, and we'll get to it shortly. The other problem is exercising more also doesn't work. These are the flip sides, right? So if you can't eat less, you should at least exercise more. I know obesity researchers who think, usually like 5'8", 130-pound male obesity researchers who think that if everyone ran marathons like they did, everybody would be lean like they are. But the evidence doesn't support that. And I could quote systematic reviews of the evidence. I find this more compelling, okay? 2007, the American Heart Association, the American College of Sports Medicine published joint physical activity guidelines. These are people who believe that physical activity is an inherent part of every lifestyle. Should be. We should all be physically active. I believe that. I work out 3 times a month because I have small children and a heavy lecture schedule, but I would like to work out more. This is what they said about. So these are people you would expect would spin the data in favor of physical activity, but about this idea that increasing your energy expenditure can actually make you leaner. They said it's reasonable to assume that persons with relatively high daily energy expenditures would be less likely to gain weight over time compared with those with low energy expenditures. So that's logical equivalent of saying if I'm a couch potato, it's reasonable to assume that I will be less likely to gain weight over time if I become a marathon runner than if I remain a couch potato. And then they say so far data to support this hypothesis are not particularly compelling. The point is this hypothesis is from 100 to 150 years old, depending on how you want to date it. And if the best you could say about an idea after 100 to 150 years is that the data to support it are not particularly compelling, you should seriously consider the possibility that the idea is simply wrong. Okay, it doesn't mean it is. Maybe the experiments were never done right, maybe they didn't use the right kind of energy expenditure or the right level of energy expenditure. But one way to look at it is it's quite likely just wrong, okay? Now, here's a reason, a way to think about why it could be wrong. So let's say tonight, Mark invited me up to talk. And one of the things I did is I rented a local restaurant. We got the 12 best chefs in Seattle to come and cook dinner at this restaurant, okay? Tonight, it's like Top Chef in Seattle again. And so there's going to be more food than you can imagine. It's going to be the best food you've ever tasted. There's going to be endless courses, you know, appetizers, entrees, first plates, second plates, desserts. And I've invited you all on the invitation to come to the lecture. You also got an invitation to come to the restaurant afterwards where we're going to have this feast. So I described the feast, and I said, look, I want you guys to come hungry. Bring your appetite. What would you do to make sure by the time you got to the restaurant after the lecture, you could eat 15 portions, the best food you ever had in your life?
Go exercise.
You might exercise during the day, work out a little more. You know, if you were going to exercise, you might do it longer or harder. You might even say, look, the restaurant's only 7 miles from here, we can walk. Right? Remember the concept of building up an appetite? And the other thing you might do is eat less during the day. Skip lunch. Why waste calories on lunch when you're going to have this feast or have a small breakfast? This was pointed out to me by a British blogger who should get credit. You know, the two things that we all would do to make sure we were hungry, to work up an appetite, eat less and exercise more, are the two things that we tell obese people to do to lose weight. That alone should tell you there's something wrong with this idea. And when somebody says that exercising more doesn't work or eating less doesn't work, it's kind of obvious why. It just makes people hungry, as they would make us hungry, even if we weren't overweight. The energy balance challenge is another one, okay? The CDC says weight management is all about balance, balancing the number of calories you consume with the number of calories your body uses or burns off. How many of you have ever tried to do this? Think about counting calories. Okay. What's fascinating is we never think about what this entails, okay? So what I'm going to tell you now is a calculation that I first read in the 1937 metabolism textbook written by the leading authority on metabolism in the United States, a fellow named Eugene Dubois, who was at Russell Sage Institute in New York, which got absorbed into Cornell University at some point. And Dubois had this calculation there for the same reason I'm going to give it to you. So what you want to know is, let's say your guys are in your mid-20s and you're lean and you don't want to become obese, right? So you don't want to gain, on average, 2 pounds a year or 20 pounds in a decade, because that means by the time you're in your 40s, you'll have gained 40 pounds, and you'll have gone from being lean to obese like many Americans do. So we want to avoid that. We're going to avoid it by counting calories, balancing calories into calories out. And you just ask the question, what does that entail? So imagine typical adult food intake in the U.S. is around 2,700 calories a day. That's average men and women, okay? So that's about 1 million calories a year. It's about 10 million calories in a decade. It's about 10 tons of food. So now we have this question, how accurately do we have to match calories into calories out on average so we don't gain the 2 pounds a year, 20 pounds in a decade, okay? And the answer is, we've got to do it to better than 21 calories a day. If I take 21 calories a day and store it in my fat tissue on average, I'm going to gain 20 pounds in a decade. Here's the calculations. Simple mathematics, okay? 20 calories a day times 365 days a year times 10 years divided by 3,500 calories per pound of fat, which is rough equivalent of the calories per pound of fat, and you end up with 21 pounds in a decade. So it's 8th grade mathematics. It's something we all could have been told when we were in 8th grade. So here's the thing. Imagine I eat 150 bites of food a day. I'm a big guy, so I eat 3,000 calories a day. 150 bites, 20 calories each, and I only burn off 149 of them. I'm going to get obese, right? This is 0.8% accuracy. And if you don't want to gain a pound a year, which is 10 pounds a decade, which still means you're going to be 20 pounds heavier in your 40s and your 20s, and it's 10 calories a day. And Dubois' point is that this is the accuracy with which we have to match calories into calories out. Nobody can do it. Even if we found the Guinness World Record holder in calorie counting, and I'm sure there is one, they'd only be guessing how much energy they expend, because that has to be measured. And even the measurements have trouble getting to 0.8% accuracy. So you could imagine ways that it can be done. Let's say as we start getting fatter, our clothes don't fit, or we look in the mirror, or we get on the scale and we say, look, I'm getting fatter, now I have to cut back, so I'm going to eat less, and I'm going to undershoot perfect energy balance. So I undershoot for a while, and then I get bored, and I start eating more, and then I overshoot, and then I start noticing I'm fat. So we can oscillate around perfect energy balance. Then you have to ask the question, how do animals do it? Because how do they know if they're getting fatter? Do they decide to the deer that have overrun New England where I grew up, do they eat less when they start gaining weight because they're worried about it? So what Dubois said, he said, there's no stranger phenomenon than the maintenance of a constant body weight under marked variation in bodily activity and food consumption. Something regulates our fat mass. But this conscious counting of calories in to calories out can't be it. Okay, it's that simple. So there are other ways to look at this, and now I have to apologize. I'm going to show photos of naked human beings, many of them overweight and obese, okay? These photos are from pre-World War II textbooks, and I am now channeling the way pre-World War II German and Austrian clinicians had come to think about obesity. And they had these photos in their textbook because they believed you could learn a lot about looking at how people get fat and where they get fat and when they get fat, instead of just whether they have a BMI over 30 or not. Okay, one is just a number, but the other one tells you something about the fattening process. So for instance, genetics. We have known that obesity has a huge genetic component since the 1920s. I mean, it's always been obvious before it was studied. But body types tend to run in families, just like facial figures do. And identical twins have the same bodies. They don't just have the same faces on entirely different bodies. So it's obvious that there's a large genetic component. It's just a lean pair of identical twins and an obese pair of identical twins. And our calories in, calories out idea might say why the obese pair are obese and the lean pair are not, because the obese pair took in more calories than they expended, and the lean pair practiced perfect energy balance. But it tells us nothing about why they have the exact same bodies. What regulates that? What controls that where the fat goes on these people? Because it's genetically controlled, and our calories idea, our energy balance idea, can't say anything about it. And you can think of this in terms of animal husbandry. Okay, we've been breeding animals to have different levels of fat, and I mean, the different characteristics for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and one of them is fat mass, fat accumulation. So on the left here, you've got a Jersey cow, which is a dairy cow. You can see the swollen udders, and on the right, you've got an Aberdeen Angus, which is a meat cow. You can see the stocky, bulky animal with its, you know, the fat and the meat here and this cutaway. The question is, what regulates this? You know, we know it's genetic, we know it's biological, because these are different breeds of cattle. So why is it that with the Jersey we can see it's so lean, we can see its ribs through its skin? What is it, because the genes are controlling how many calories per bite of, you know, hay or grass or whatever it happens to be eating that day, or how many bites it takes over the course of the day compared to the Aberdeen Angus, or maybe the genes are telling the Jersey to go for a jog at night after it gets dark, like that Far Side cartoon where the Aberdeen Angus is, you know, going into the barn and watching television. And that's obviously kind of absurd. So one way to think about it is, you know, all ethical issues aside, the Jersey, what we want that animal to do is produce milk. So we want it to take in fuel on one side and turn it into milk. And we don't want that fuel accumulating all over its body because that's inefficient. So maybe what this animal is doing, and the Aberdeen Angus, we do want that fuel accumulating as protein and fat content in its body. So maybe what the genes are controlling is not how much energy they take in or expend, but how they use that energy, how they allocate it or partition it, whether to milk in the case of the Jersey or to body fat and protein in the case of the Aberdeen Angus. So if these genes are energy partitioning genes or energy allocation genes, we can start understanding these different breeds. Then there are sexual variations, okay? You know, men get fat above the waist, women get fat below the waist, okay? This guy put on, when he got obese in his gut, he doubled his risk of heart disease. When this woman put on the weight below her waist, she did not. So you just ask the simple question, what does the calories have to do with it? Okay, they both took in more calories than they expended at some point because they were getting fatter. But why did it go above the waist in the man and below the waist in the woman? And what's interesting is you could also ask the question, like if we wanted that man to be thin, all we would have to do is figure out why that woman was not accumulating fat above her waist. Because then we could somehow translate that to the guy and his gut would go away. And if we wanted that woman to be thin, we could figure out why this guy is so relatively lean below the waist. There's something about their fat tissue that's deciding whether or not it's going to take up fat. It's got nothing to do with the energy taken in or Here's another example, puberty. Boys and girls enter puberty with roughly the same amount of body fat. Okay, as they go through puberty, the boys get bigger, they take in more calories than they expend, but they lose fat and gain muscle. And the girls get bigger, they take in more calories than they expend, but they gain fat, and they do it in very specific places. Okay, from an evolutionary perspective, these are places that will eventually drive the boys crazy. And the question is, we know that they took in more calories than they expended because they were both growing, but why is it the boys lost fat and gained muscle when the girls gained fat and gained it in specific places? By the time puberty's over, the girls have 50% more fat than the boys do. So what do the calories have to do with it? What does this energy balance idea have to do with it? Okay? I mean, we know that they were in positive energy balance, but that tells us nothing about what happened to their bodies. Okay, and that's the idea that I want to get across, which is this idea that can take calories in, calories out tells you something meaningful, is it doesn't. If they got bigger, they took in more calories than they expended. So the last photo, by the time I had this photo in the book, my editor was saying, Gary, your book is beginning to look like a freak show. Would you please rein it in a little? So a lipodystrophy is a disorder of fat accumulation. Okay, this is a particular lipodystrophy called progressive lipodystrophy. By the 1950s, there are about 200 of these cases in the medical literature, that 80% were in women. In these cases, the reason it's called progressive is they start losing subcutaneous fat in their forehead, and it progresses downward. One British physician measured in one of his patients, it progressed down at the rate of an inch a year, and then often it would stop at the waist. And then you get this lower body obesity developing beneath it. This woman happened to have a BMI of 34, but effectively all of her body fat was below her waist. And the way these Europeans looked at it, they said, oh, are we going to blame the top half on undereating and the bottom half on overeating? And that's obviously absurd, right? But if we can't do this, if she had 5 more pounds of fat on her upper body, you wouldn't recognize the lipodystrophy. Her BMI was over 30 anyway. She'd walk into a doctor's office, and the doctor would say, well, you've got to eat less and exercise more. But without that, you can see that there's no way that she got that. The leanness came from undereating, and there's arguably no way the obesity came from taking in too many calories. Something else has to be working here. So the reason we believe this idea that it's all about energy, is physics. It's the first law of thermodynamics. Okay, and whenever somebody discusses this, like I do, and they argue that it's not about calories, we're accused of not understanding the laws of thermodynamics. I have obesity researchers I've been discussing this with for years who still will end emails to me saying, I believe in the laws of thermodynamics. Actually, I was on national television. I was on the Larry King show, and Jillian Rose came on. Jillian Michaels, the trainer from The Biggest Loser, and she came on and gave me a lecture on thermodynamics on national television. And I have a physics degree from Harvard. And you can watch this online. It's on YouTube. I was literally speechless. What was I going to say? Jillian, so now I get out my passive aggression. Jillian, let me explain the laws of thermodynamics to you. First law of thermodynamics is the law of energy conservation. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. It can only change form. So what that means is if some system gets more energetic, it has to take in more energy than it expends. If it gets less energetic, it has to expend more than it takes in, because energy can't just be created or destroyed. It's only changes form. So we transform this into this energy balance equation. Delta E is a change of energy in a system, is equal to the energy that goes in minus the energy that goes out. It's it's the one law of thermodynamics that's insanely simple to understand. So in this case, we then say change in fat mass is equal to energy consumed minus energy expended, okay? And the idea is, if you take in more energy than you expend, then delta E is positive and you get heavier, more massive. And if you expend more than you take in, then delta E is negative and you get less massive. And this always has to be true. That's why they call it a law. So here's the problem. We take this truth about the way the universe works and we put a causality on it. What we say is, look, if E in goes up, if I eat more, but I don't compensate by expending more, so E out stays the same, then delta E goes up. I get more massive. Therefore, eating too much causes obesity. And if E out were to go down, if I become sedentary, but I don't compensate by eating less, delta E becomes positive, I become more massive. Therefore, sedentary behavior causes obesity. So I take this law that says nothing about causality. Just says this is the way the universe works. If somebody got more if anything gets more massive, it takes in more energy than it expends, and I put a causality on it. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say you and I were walking down the street in downtown Seattle, and we saw a restaurant that was packed. Okay, all the restaurants around it were pretty empty, but this restaurant was really crowded, and it was always crowded. And so you turned to me and you said, look, instead of wanting to know why somebody has so much energy stored in their fat tissue, we want to know why there's so much energy stored as people in this restaurant. So you asked me, thinking I know something about Seattle, which I don't, but you slide over there and you say, look, Gary, why is that restaurant so crowded? And I said, why is it so full of energy? And I said, well, because more people entered than left. That's the exact equivalent of saying you got fat because you took in more energy than you expended. But if I told you anything meaningful about why the restaurant's crowded, okay, you might turn to me and say, Gary, obviously more people entered than left. It's crowded. That's a given, right? And actually, if somebody's gotten fatter, it's a given that they took in more energy than they expended. So now I say, but if more people enter than leave, it's got to get crowded, right? It's got to get full of energy. Have I told you anything meaningful? And it's the exact logical equivalent of saying if somebody eats more than they expend, they have to get fat. And the fact is I haven't. This is what logicians would call vacuously true. Fatuous, it's got to be true, but it tells you nothing. So there are a lot of explanations for why that restaurant could be crowded. Food is great, free drinks, happy hour, Angelina Jolie's having dinner in there, and all these people ran in to see it. Maybe it's pouring outside and it's the only restaurant that's open. Maybe there's a theater district in Seattle, I don't know, and it's like 7 o'clock right before theater time, it's the only restaurant with good food. Maybe it's 100 degrees outside, it's the only restaurant with air conditioning, and the other restaurants don't. Maybe there are huge doormen standing at the door, grabbing people who walk by, throwing them and not letting them leave. So these are all explanations, right, for why the restaurant could be crowded, whereas more people entering than leaving is not. Actually, the restaurant could be empty and having more people entering than leaving, and it could be packed and having more people leaving and entering. So that doesn't even tell you why it's crowded, it just tells you why there's a change. So all these explanations talk about the conditions inside the restaurant, the conditions outside the restaurant, and the conditions at the bar. So like free drinks, happy hour, great food, Angelina Jolie, air conditioning, those are the conditions inside the restaurant. 100 degrees outside, pouring rain, the theater district, these are conditions outside the restaurant, and then conditions at the boundary, like the big doormat. So these are meaningful explanations. And what we want to know when we talk about obesity, and this is the biggest, this stuns me, okay? When we talk about obesity, and you say it's about taking more energy than it expends, you don't care what's regulating how a fat cell takes up fat. What we really want to know is why does this person have a lot of energy in his or her fat cells and the other person doesn't? So instead of saying, look, there are all these reasons about the conditions in the fat cell and outside the fat cell and at the boundary that might explain this, we just say, look, they ate too much and they expended too little. It's like if I was talking about Manhattan instead of Seattle, I grew up, spent a lot of time in Manhattan, we want to know why the restaurant was crowded. It's like I said, look, if more people come in through the bridges and tunnels than leave through the bridges and tunnels, then those restaurants are going to get crowded. And that's not even true. The whole city could get crowded and that restaurant could stay empty. We want to know what's going on in that restaurant. Just like we want to know what's going on with fat cells. And our obesity theory tells us nothing about it. It's bizarre. Okay, so there's an alternative hypothesis. This is a European hypothesis, as I said. And one of the interesting things is, it got accepted in Europe by 1940, as I'll describe, and then it vanished with the Second World War. Post-war, there was anti-German sentiment in the U.S., as in much of the world, and we just stopped citing the German literature. So one of the things that happened that I learned about, I had no idea about, was that pre-World War II, German was the lingua franca of science. Post-World War II, English was. But we stopped citing the German literature. In the field I grew up in, physics, the European physicists used to say the best thing that ever happened to American science was Hitler. This is what they told me when I did a book on high-energy physics in Geneva, Switzerland in 1985. Because he chased all these brilliant physicists to the US, and we embraced them because we had atomic bombs to build and hydrogen bombs to build and a Cold War to fight, rockets to build. In medicine and public health, we wanted nothing to do with these people. So not only did we not embrace them or give them jobs, we stopped citing their literature entirely, and we recreated the whole field of obesity in the 1950s at the Harvard School of Nutrition. We also went from people who were clinical investigators. They were MDs who studied and treated patients. So they took histories from their patients and photographed them and talked to them. And we switched from these people who treated human patients to nutritionists who did studies on vitamin C metabolism in rats. And these were the people who built this paradigm that we all believed in, that I believed, that it's all about taking in too much energy. So the way these pre-World War II Europeans saw it, they said obesity is a disorder of excess fat accumulations. It's not energy balance, it's not overeating, it's not sedentary behavior. This is first principles for science. When you're doing science, the idea is start with the definition of the problem that has the least possible assumptions attached. But you could say having too much fat is a disorder of having too much fat, and it sounds so meaningless that you haven't said anything. But in fact, if you just said that, the first question you would ask is what regulates fat accumulation? It's like having a crowded restaurant is a disorder of having a crowded restaurant. What regulates the number of people who go into and out of restaurants? Okay, in this hypothesis, overeating and inactivity are compensatory effects. They're not causes. I'll describe that in a minute. We don't get fat because we overeat. This is how it was told to me both by researchers who study fat accumulation in animals for reasons other than studying obesity, and how the Europeans phrase it. We don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because our fat tissue is accumulating excess fat. So it's not that behavior is driving physiology. Physiology is driving behavior. So this is our conventional wisdom, okay? E in and E out, how much we eat and how much we exercise our behaviors, and the idea is we change those behaviors, somehow get changed either by the environment or our own moral turpitude, and that changes the amount of energy we store in the body. And our alternative hypothesis, the amount of energy we store in the body is very well regulated. Everything in the living organisms is excruciatingly well regulated, and if that changes, it's going to change intake and expenditure. So here's an example. Here's an analogy that the Germans and Austrians used, a growing child, okay? So here's this excruciatingly cute one-year-old back in 2006, weighed 20 pounds, okay? There he is 3 years later, he's 45 pounds, he's gained 25 pounds, he's taken in more energy than he expended, right? He's been in positive energy balance. But he didn't grow because he was in positive energy balance, okay? He was in positive energy balance because he was growing. You know, his brain is secreting, his pituitary gland is secreting growth hormone, which is stimulating insulin-like growth factor, which is causing him to grow. And he's compensating by eating more and exercising less. The parents in the room know when their kids go through growth spurts, they eat voraciously and they lie around the house all day long. But that's not why they're growing. They're eating voraciously and lying around the house all day long because they're growing. So growth is the cause, and their bodies compensate by either trying to take in more energy or expend less if they can. Here's a pathological example. Cancer, you can see this tumor growing. This tumor's in positive energy balance. It's taking in more energy than it expends. That's not why it's growing, right? It's growing because it's got oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes that are mutated and have defects and are being driven to uncontrolled growth. And in order to fuel that growth, it's taking in as much energy as it can. The point is, growth is the cause. Energy balance is the effect. And the argument I'm making is that in every example in medicine, every example in biology, growth is a cause. So an animal is being driven to grow, and its energy balance is a result of that. It's not a cause. And I recently gave a talk to cardiologists at the Mayo Clinic. And I said, why is it that from the moment they enter medical school to the moment they retire, the only disorder they will ever confront in which they will go to a physics textbook for the way to treat it is obesity. Every other disorder, you go to a medical textbook, right? Biochemistry, physiology, endocrinology, but not physics. It's simply not relevant.